The bullet had absolutely demolished Maximilien Robespierre's jaw, shattered it into smithereens, with jagged bone fragments spilling out like confetti every single time he even attempted to mutter a word. Can you even picture that kind of agony? For a grueling 14 hours straight, this once mighty figure, the very man who'd casually doomed over 17,000 innocent souls to their gruesome ends, just slumped there in a creaky old chair at the Committee of Public Safety. Blood oozing everywhere, his mangled face hastily wrapped in these filthy, blood-soaked bandages that looked like they'd been scavenged from a dumpster. And get this, right in the next room, his former so-called allies were popping corks, laughing it up, and celebrating his total downfall like it was New Year's Eve. Then, the moment of truth, when the executioner roughly tore away those makeshift wrappings. Robespierre unleashed a scream so blood-curdling, so piercingly raw, that it instantly hushed the massive, roaring crowd of 200,000 spectators who'd flocked from all over Paris just to witness his demise. Imagine the chill running down your spine. 200,000 people, dead silent for a heartbeat. That infamous guillotine, the same cold steel blade that had already claimed the heads of Marie Antoinette, King Louis XVI, and thousands upon thousands more during the infamous Reign of Terror. It was now poised, waiting eagerly for the very architect who'd designed that whole nightmare. His final seconds were ticking down, fast. Think about it. This was the guy once idolized as the incorruptible. A humble lawyer who stuck to wearing the same plain, unassuming brown coat every single day, stubbornly refusing lavish bribes and glittering gifts from fancy foreign dignitaries who tried to sway him. For 3 long, terrifying years, Robespierre had been the absolute boogeyman of France, the name that made knees knock and whispers hush. He'd sign those death sentences with the casual flick of a pen, like you or I might jot down a grocery list. A lifelong childhood friend. No hesitation. Guillotine. Dare to whisper his name in the wrong crowd at a tavern. Boom, you'd find yourself rotting in a dank prison cell before the sun even peeked over the horizon. His signature alone was basically a one-way ticket to the scaffold. But on that fateful day, July 28, 1794, the tables had turned dramatically. Robespierre wasn't feared anymore. No, he was just another pitiful, broken shell of a man, trembling as he awaited his inevitable doom. So how on earth does someone like that, a man who boldly claimed to channel the pure, unfiltered will of the people, end up utterly despised by those exact same masses who'd once cheered his speeches like he was a rock star? Come on, let's unpack this together. The real answer hides in those chaotic 16 months that skyrocketed a quiet provincial lawyer into becoming Europe's most dangerous and ruthless power player. And the whirlwind 24 hours that shattered him into oblivion. It all kicked off with one deeply flawed conviction that slowly but surely consumed him from the inside out. The twisted idea that true virtue could be enforced, beaten into society through sheer, unrelenting violence. Born way up in the northern town of Arras back in 1758, Robespierre grew up scraping by on modest scholarships, no silver spoon in sight. He buried himself in studies, became a lawyer, and genuinely, passionately believed the French Revolution could forge a flawless, utopian society where equality reigned supreme. While his fellow revolutionaries were out there indulging in extravagant wines, stuffing their pockets with shady bribes, and living the high life, Robespierre kept it real simple. He rented this tiny, cramped room right above a noisy carpenter's workshop. Think sawdust and hammers all day. His meals, basic as they come. His schedule, brutal 18-hour workdays, fueled by nothing but his books, his threadbare clothes, and this rock-solid, unshakable belief that he, and he alone, truly grasped what France desperately needed to thrive. No romance, no family, no fancy estate. His entire existence narrowed down to one obsessive mission, reshaping France into his vision of perfection. By 1792, though, things had darkened. Robespierre reached this chilling conclusion that would change everything. Disagree with his views? You're automatically an enemy of the people, plain and simple. Dare to question his harsh methods? Boom, labeled corrupt. Show even a hint of mercy to so-called traitors? Traitor yourself, No middle ground. Then, in April 1793, he masterminded the creation of the Committee of Public Safety. Sounds innocent enough, right? But within just 6 short months, it morphed into the most efficient, cold-blooded killing machine Europe had ever witnessed. Picture this daily ritual. Every morning at precisely 9 a.m., the committee members would gather in this ordinary room overlooking a peaceful garden. By 10 a.m., they'd already decided who lived and who died that day. No fuss, no second thoughts. The stats, absolutely staggering, enough to make your stomach turn. Between September 1793 and July 1794, the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris alone condemned a whopping 2,639 people to death. Down in Lyon, 1,880 executions. Toulon clocked in at 282. And in Nantes, oh man, it got even more horrific. They'd cram prisoners onto rickety barges, sail them out onto the Loire River, and deliberately sink them because the guillotine simply couldn't keep up with the demand. Those bloated, decomposing bodies floated downstream for weeks on end, washing ashore more than 20 miles away. Entire villages, ones that hadn't even seen a single revolutionary soldier, complained endlessly about the unbearable stench wafting through the air. Can you imagine living with that constant reminder of death? Robespierre, he was meticulous about it all, like some deranged accountant obsessed with ledgers. His reports listed every single detail, each victim's name, their age, their everyday occupation, and the supposed crime they'd committed, all documented with chilling precision. But the charges, often downright absurd, straight out of a nightmare. A baker who dared to charge a few extra cents for bread during shortages. Guillotine, a priest who refused to swear blind loyalty to the new secular state. Guillotine, a weary woman who simply complained about endless food lines. Guillotine, even a wide-eyed 14-year-old boy who shouted, "Long live the king," in the heat of a street brawl. You guessed it. Guillotine. Nobody got a pass. A frail old nobleman too weak to even walk to the scaffold. Guards carried him there anyway. Guillotine. A pregnant woman who tearfully begged to live just long enough to give birth to her child. Plea denied, executed that very same day. Mercy? What mercy? Every single morning, without fail, prison guards would read aloud from Robespierre's infamous lists to the terrified inmates crammed into cells designed for half their numbers, bodies pressed together in filthy, overcrowded hellholes. The condemned, herded like cattle into wooden tumbrel carts and paraded slowly through the bustling streets of Paris. Crowds lined the routes, hurling garbage, sharp stones, and even buckets of human waste at the prisoners as the carts rattled along. That agonizing journey from prison to the scaffold, it lasted exactly 45 minutes of pure, unrelenting torment. At the Place de la Révolution, the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, a pro at this grim trade, dispatched victims with mechanical efficiency. The bloodthirsty crowd would count down from 10, building the suspense. Then, thud, the blade plummeted. Head tumbled into a wicker basket below. Body slid unceremoniously into a pit filled with quicklime to speed up decomposition. No dignity, no last rites. Robespierre himself rarely showed up to these spectacles. He preferred to stay detached. But oh, he devoured the detailed reports like they were his favorite novel. He even kept a personal journal, jotting down not just the names of the dead, but their final words, how composed or not they seemed, and whether they showed sufficient remorse in their last moments. When the former Queen Marie Antoinette faced her end on October 16, 1793, marching to the guillotine with surprising calm, Robespierre scribbled in his notes that it just proved she'd never truly understood or cared about the suffering of ordinary French people. And when his one-time ally, the larger-than-life Georges Danton, was executed on April 5, 1794, Robespierre noted coldly that Danton's desperate pleas for mercy exposed his fundamental corruption at the core. By early 1794, the cracks were showing. Robespierre was unraveling fast, like a tightly wound spring finally snapping. Sleep? Maybe 3 hours a night, tops. A nervous tic had his left eye blinking uncontrollably during his fiery speeches. He barely stepped out in public anymore, except for official ceremonies where he had to show face. When he did speak, his voice had shifted, high-pitched, shrill, almost unhinged. His committee colleagues started noticing weird behaviors, muttering to himself mid-meeting, debating invisible foes, even bursting into laughter at jokes only he could hear. The daughter of his landlord later testified under oath, verified fact, that she'd often hear him pacing back and forth through the dead of night, rehearsing impassioned speeches to empty chairs like some ghostly audience. He began carrying a loaded pistol everywhere he went, even plunking it down right on the table during committee sessions next to his stacks of papers. His handwriting, once so neat and precise, turned erratic and nearly illegible. Documents from those final frantic months are marred with ugly ink blots, words furiously scratched out over and over, and margins crammed with nonsensical scribbles that make no sense. In his private diary, pages upon pages of it, he'd repeat the same manic phrase obsessively: "The Republic of Virtue will triumph," sometimes scribbling it 50 times on a single page like a broken record. What was going on in his head? Paranoia? Madness? We'll never know for sure, but the signs were screaming. Then came the tipping point, the infamous Law of 22 Prairial. Under this draconian decree, trials could wrap up in as little as 15 minutes flat. Defendants? Forbidden from having any legal counsel to defend them. Possible verdicts? Only two: acquittal or death, no in between. Once it passed, executions skyrocketed overnight, tripling from an already horrifying 5 per day to 15 or more. The blood flowed like never before, but here's where he overplayed his hand. Big time. His once loyal colleagues finally woke up to the danger. They realized, if we don't stop this madman now, our own names will end up on those deadly lists sooner or later. A clandestine meeting was called in the shadows. Key players like Joseph Fouché, Paul Barras, and Jean-Lambert Tallien huddled together to plot what they grimly dubbed the necessary action. The stakes? Sky high. Fail, and Robespierre would have them all guillotined within 24 hours. Succeed, and they might just save their skins while putting an end to the endless terror. Their plan was straightforward but risky: convince enough members of the National Convention that Robespierre was secretly planning to arrest and execute them all. Then strike hard and fast before he could make his move. July 27, 1794, dawned like any other day in the Reign of Terror, business as usual. Robespierre rose at the crack of dawn, around 5 a.m., poring over reports from the provinces, meticulously preparing a speech to defend his iron-fisted policies. He had zero inkling that 43 key members of the convention had already signed a secret pact, vowing to denounce him the instant he stepped into the chamber. At noon, he strode confidently into the Tuileries Palace, decked out in his signature sky-blue coat and pristinely powdered white wig. He truly believed his unmatched rhetoric and self-proclaimed moral authority would silence any whispers of opposition, just like it always had in the past. But oh, how wrong he was. This time, everything was different. The second Robespierre rose to speak, chaos erupted. Shouts exploded from every corner of the hall, a tidal wave of defiance. For the first time in 3 blood-soaked years, the deputies of the convention openly turned on him. "Down with the tyrant," one bellowed. "You are the enemy of the people," thundered another. Robespierre tried desperately to respond, but his words were swallowed by a deafening chant that echoed off the walls. "Death to Robespierre! Death to Robespierre!" The man who'd terrorized an entire nation for years stood there, utterly speechless, as his former allies betrayed him with the same merciless, calculated efficiency he'd once wielded against countless others. Guards surged forward to arrest him. Robespierre looked completely stunned, as if his brain couldn't process the betrayal. "You cannot arrest virtue," he cried out wildly as they clamped down on his arms. "I am the representative of the people." But those very representatives of the people dragged him away without a shred of pity, while massive crowds outside cheered so loudly that the jubilant noise carried for 6 full city blocks. First stop for the fallen leader, the Luxembourg prison. But the warden flat out refused to take him in. The man who'd condemned so many was now deemed too dangerous, too toxic to house. Next, they tried the conciergerie, the grim spot where Marie Antoinette had spent her final desperate days. Officials there? Nope, sent him packing too. For a humiliating 3 hours, Robespierre was shuttled from one prison to another, rejected at every single gate like a pariah. All the while, he protested non-stop, insisting his arrest was utterly illegal, demanding to be brought before the Committee of Public Safety. But nobody listened. Not a soul. At long last, he was dumped at the Hôtel de Ville, where his devoted brother Augustin and a ragtag handful of loyal supporters had gathered, frantically hoping to orchestrate a daring rescue. Inside, Robespierre scribbled what he convinced himself would be his ultimate game-changing speech, an impassioned, fiery defense of his actions that he truly believed would rally the ordinary people of Paris to his side. He pictured it vividly. Once the common folk realized what was happening to their champion, they'd rise up en masse, just like they had against the despised king years before. His allies mustered their courage and attempted to march on the convention building. But when they hit the streets, crickets, empty cobblestones stretching out, the sans-culottes, the working-class radicals who'd once followed Robespierre with blind, fanatical devotion, now stayed hunkered down in their homes, unwilling to risk it. The National Guard easily dispersed the few stragglers who did show up, with barely any resistance at all. By 2 a.m., it was painfully clear. The rescue attempt had fizzled into nothing. The self-proclaimed embodiment of the will of the people had just discovered, in the harshest way possible, that the people no longer gave a damn about what he had to say. Around 3 a.m. on July 28th, forces loyal to the convention stormed the Hôtel de Ville in a blaze of chaos. In the midst of the pandemonium, a single gunshot cracked through the room where Robespierre sat, still scribbling his doomed speech. Witnesses couldn't agree on the details. Some swore it was a botched suicide attempt. Others claimed a guard's pistol went off by accident. A few insisted a young gendarme named Charles-André Merdat deliberately pulled the trigger. Debates raged for years, but one thing everyone agreed on: the brutal result. The bullet blasted straight through Robespierre's mouth, exploding out the left side of his jaw, pulverizing the bone into fragments and knocking out several teeth in a spray of blood. He collapsed forward across the wooden table, bleeding profusely but cruelly, still fully conscious, writhing in unimaginable pain. A military surgeon named Pierre-François Percy rushed in to examine him and confirmed the worst. The jaw was shattered in at least 3 places. The injury was excruciating, a living hell, but not immediately fatal. No quick mercy there. Someone nearby grabbed a tablecloth, tore it into rough strips, and bound up his ruined face in these impromptu bandages to stem the flow. Then, in a twist of poetic justice, Robespierre was hauled right back to the Committee of Public Safety, the very institution he'd once lorded over with godlike absolute power. There, he endured the next 14 agonizing hours, sitting in pure torment, waiting for the end he knew was coming. Those final hours, they were a cruel mirror-image reflection of the suffering he'd inflicted on thousands of victims. He tasted the same gut-wrenching psychological torture, the absolute certainty of death, yet the agonizing uncertainty of exactly when it would strike. Unable to speak coherently, every attempt just brought more blood and garbled moans. He slumped in the very chair where he'd once signed off on countless death warrants. All the while, forced to listen as his traitorous colleagues partied and celebrated his downfall in the adjoining room, their laughter seeping through the walls like salt in a wound. Guards would poke their heads in occasionally, mocking him. "Any last words, tyrant? Care to confess your crimes?" When he tried to respond, only mangled, bloody sounds emerged from his destroyed jaw, humiliating, dehumanizing. Meanwhile, outside those walls, word of his impending execution spread like wildfire through Paris. By dawn, thousands had already staked out the best viewing spots near the scaffold, turning it into a macabre festival. Street vendors hawked bread, cheap wine, and sweet pastries to the growing throngs. For many, this wasn't just another execution, it was a holiday, a cathartic release. Children darted through the crowds, playing twisted games where they pretended to be Robespierre, marching to his decapitation. Women sat calmly knitting, just as they'd done during hundreds of prior executions, a chilling habit born of the terror. But this day felt electric, different from the rest. It wasn't mere morbid curiosity driving the masses. No, this was raw, unfiltered vengeance. People huddled in groups, swapping heart-wrenching stories of relatives and friends who'd been lost to Robespierre's guillotine. Some brought faded portraits of their executed loved ones, holding them high like defiant banners. Others carried crude, homemade effigies of Robespierre, ready to torch them after the show. Street musicians belted out mocking songs, ridiculing the fallen dictator. Poets stood on crates, reciting satirical verses that roasted his hypocrisy. And in a bizarre twist, verified from contemporary accounts, even prostitutes roamed the crowds, offering free services to anyone who could share a personal tale of grievance against him. Paris had transformed into one gigantic, feverish carnival, all centered on celebrating the death of a single man. At 4 p.m., Robespierre and 21 of his closest allies were finally loaded into the death carts for the slow procession to the Place de la Révolution. Normally a straightforward 45-minute trip? Not today. It dragged on for nearly 2 full hours as massive crowds clogged every street, slowing the carts to a crawl while hurling endless insults and projectiles at the prisoners. "There goes the monster," they'd shout. "Behold the tyrant in his shame." Robespierre's bandages were completely soaked through with fresh blood, a gruesome sight. His once dignified blue coat was torn to shreds and stained beyond recognition. The iconic powdered wig, long gone, exposing his prematurely grey hair, a telltale sign of his sleepless, paranoia-filled months. Too weak to even hold his head up, he slumped forward pathetically, chin pressed against his chest, occasionally lifting his eyes to glance at the jeering mob, but never daring to meet anyone's gaze directly. The man who'd once commanded silence from crowds with a mere gesture was reduced to nothing, a ruined, anonymous prisoner on the road to oblivion. When the carts finally creaked to a halt at the scaffold, the roar from the 200,000-strong crowd was absolutely deafening, shaking the ground. People had packed every possible vantage point: windows, rooftops, balconies, even dangling from lampposts. Some had shelled out exorbitant sums for premium seats with unobstructed views. Others climbed trees or perched precariously on friends' shoulders. The atmosphere? Unlike any execution before. During the height of the terror, crowds had gathered with a grim, almost mechanical thirst for blood. Today, though, the air crackled with pure, unrestrained joy, a collective sigh of relief mixed with triumphant glee. Executioner Charles-Henri Sanson, who'd already presided over nearly 3,000 deaths in his career, later confessed in his memoirs, another verified fact, that this was the toughest day he'd ever faced. Not because of the executions themselves, but because the mob's frenzy was so intense, so volatile, he genuinely feared they'd storm the scaffold and tear the prisoners apart before he could do his job properly. As Robespierre was roughly dragged from the cart and up the steps, the crowd's screams of approval hit such a fever pitch that windows in nearby buildings actually shattered from the sheer volume. Then came the moment etched into history, the one no witness ever forgot. Sanson's assistant gripped the filthy, blood-caked bandages that had held Robespierre's shattered jaw together for those 14 torturous hours, and ripped them away in one swift motion. His mouth gaped open unnaturally, and out came a shriek so raw, so profoundly animalistic, that for several frozen seconds the entire sprawling square fell into stunned silence. Eyewitnesses described it as an inhuman cry, the sound of a soul being ripped to shreds. Someone in the crowd broke the hush, shouting, "That is the cry of all his victims." The words caught fire, the chant spread, and the roar that followed shook Paris to its core. Sanson, ever the professional, performed his duty with flawless precision. The countdown echoed, the blade dropped, the head fell cleanly into the basket. Death was instantaneous, at last. But here's where things went off script. Normally, executions ended with polite applause and folks dispersed quietly. Not this time. The city erupted into wild celebration, like a pressure valve finally bursting. Men and women danced spontaneously in the streets. Total strangers embraced like long-lost family. Wine bottles passed hand to hand, toasts ringing out. Vendors capitalized on the chaos, selling souvenirs, bits of wood claimed to be from the scaffold, scraps of cloth supposedly soaked in Robespierre's blood. The revelry stretched well into the night, a city-wide party that refused to die down. Messengers galloped across France, carrying the news far and wide. Spontaneous festivals ignited everywhere it landed. In Lyon, where nearly 2,000 had perished under the Terror, citizens built enormous bonfires from seized furniture and gleefully tossed effigies of Robespierre into the flames, watching them burn. In Marseille, the port bells tolled joyously for 6 straight hours, while ships in the harbour fired their cannons in salute. In Bordeaux, wine merchants threw open their cellars, handing out their finest bottles free to anyone willing to raise a glass to the death of the tyrant. From one corner of France to the other, waves of jubilation rolled like thunder, washing away the fear. Almost overnight, the gruesome machinery of death screeched to a halt. The Revolutionary Tribunal dissolved immediately, the dreaded law of 22 prairial. Repealed on the spot. Mass executions. Ceased cold turkey. Prisoners who'd been awaiting certain death in their cells were suddenly set free, stumbling into the sunlight in disbelief. Exiled nobles began trickling back home, reclaiming what was left. Markets reopened to private traders, and fresh food appeared on shelves within days. Bread lines shortened, stomachs filled. Churches, once forcibly shuttered or repurposed as temples of reason, swung open their doors to worshippers once more. Newspapers, freed from mandatory government propaganda, exploded with independent voices and bold opinions. Children, who'd been brainwashed to denounce even their own parents as traitors, stopped spying and started playing like kids again. Workers, too terrified before to complain, began organizing strikes and demanding fair wages without fear of reprisal. For the first time in over a year, Paris burst into open conversation, as if 3 million people had been collectively holding their breath and could finally, gloriously exhale. On July 29th, the very next day after Robespierre's execution, 0 people were condemned to death in Paris. July 30th, 0 again. For the first time in 10 brutal months, the guillotine sat idle and rusting for an entire week. Prisons, once bursting at the seams with far more inmates than they could hold, emptied so rapidly that guards were left scratching their heads, wondering what to do with all the sudden empty space. The Terror was over, done, finished, not with a bang, but with a collective sigh of relief. Unlike other revolutionary bigwigs who got at least some semblance of a funeral ceremony, Robespierre and his 21 executed allies were treated like garbage, literal refuse. Their bodies were unceremoniously dumped into a common, unmarked grave at the Erensis cemetery, doused heavily with quicklime to accelerate decay and erase any trace. No headstones, no memorials. Hell, no records were even kept of the exact burial spot. Within a few short years, the entire cemetery vanished beneath new houses and bustling shops. It was as if Robespierre had never existed at all, wiped from the map. He'd built this elaborate system, convinced it would eliminate all enemies of the people through what he called revolutionary justice. To him, violence wasn't just a tool, it was virtuous, sacred even, as long as it defended the so-called general will. He deluded himself into believing every single execution brought France one step closer to his dreamed-up perfect society. But in the end, that same system turned on him, consuming its creator with the exact cold, efficient brutality he'd unleashed on others. Terror, once set loose, recognizes no master. It spares nobody, not even the one who birthed it. Let's debunk a myth right here. Robespierre wasn't born a monster. Verified facts from his early writings show he once opposed the death penalty outright, championed compassion for the poor, and railed against corruption. But power corrupted him absolutely. His high ideals twisted into indiscriminate slaughter. Each death he ordered made the next one easier to justify, lowering the bar until killing became as routine as stamping paperwork. The small-town lawyer, who'd started with noble intentions, transformed into French history's most prolific killer, all while patting himself on the back, claiming every severed head served virtue and justice. Robespierre's last sound on earth, that infamous scream torn from his ruined jaw as the bandages were stripped away. Witnesses, dozens of them, in letters and diaries, swore it wasn't human. For a split second, the 200,000-strong crowd froze, stunned into absolute silence. Then that shout, "That is the cry of all his victims." The chant swelled, and the ensuing roar practically shook the foundations of Paris. That scream, it was his final involuntary confession, the moment the architect of the terror realized the monster he'd built had been lurking, waiting to devour him all along. On July 29, 1794, the day after, Paris felt quieter than it had in 3 exhausting years. The scaffold was dismantled piece by piece. The death carts were retired to dusty warehouses. For the first time since the revolution ignited, ordinary citizens went to bed without that gnawing dread of being arrested before dawn. The reign of terror had ended, not through some grand act of mercy or forgiveness, but through the icy calculation that the man who'd made himself indispensable to the death machine had suddenly become expendable to those who now controlled it. For some folks, even today, Robespierre remains the incorruptible, a principled guy who rejected bribes, dressed humbly, and genuinely believed in the revolution's purity. For others, just a bloodthirsty murderer who drowned France in rivers of gore. What can't be denied, backed by mountains of historical records, is the tragic transformation. From a young, idealistic lawyer fighting tyranny, he became tyranny incarnate. He insisted to his dying breath that he embodied virtue. But history remembers the screams, the endless executions, and those meticulous lists of doomed names. Robespierre's fall hammered home a brutal lesson for France and the world. Once terror becomes your tool of governance, it's impossible to control. It corrodes everything in its path: law, morality, friendships, even patriotism. He thought he was sculpting a republic of virtue. In reality, he forged a republic of fear. His story stands as the starkest warning of how absolute certainty in your own righteousness can justify the most unthinkable cruelties. A man who began with real compassion for the downtrodden and a burning hatred of corruption ended up slaughtering indiscriminately friends, strangers, women, children, all while telling himself it was for the greater good. The day after his death, markets buzzed back to life, churches held open services, families gathered without glancing over their shoulders for informants. Children laughed and played freely in the streets. Conversations long silenced by paranoia flowed again, like life itself had been paused on a remote control and someone finally hit play. It was as though France had been collectively holding its breath for those endless 16 months of horror, and could finally, deeply breathe. Meanwhile, Robespierre's name became synonymous with curse and cautionary tale. The self-styled guardian of virtue, who shunned wealth and wore the same plain coat daily, had morphed into the very monster he'd sworn to destroy. His death wasn't a victory of mercy over cruelty. No, it was the inevitable implosion of a system that devoured anyone who dared touch it. For years afterward, the echo of Robespierre's scream haunted Paris. Legend has it, though grounded in witness accounts, that for a brief instant, that sound carried the mingled voices of every victim he'd condemned. It was the noise of justice warped into vengeance, of noble ideals contorted into pure horror, and it served as the final damning proof that the republic of virtue he'd obsessed over had never truly been born, and that the revolution, in its frenzy, had consumed its own profit. What do you think? Could something like this happen again? History's full of warnings. Let's hope we heed them.